So to understand where we're going as far as the market is concerned, it's important to understand where we've been. So I'm going to kind of show you the last 14 years in the next couple of minutes here of market history, and then sum up this video by showing you where we think the market is likely headed. So back here in the 90s, we have a rapidly rising market. Now, if you think about why we had a rising market back then in the context of what I've just showed you, I just showed you that consumer spending is what drives the economy. And consumers peak in their spending in their mid to late 40s. So when you have rising numbers of 45 to 50-year-olds, you're going to have a healthy economy. So the baby boom started in 1945, right? So 45 years later, the leading edge of the baby boom would be hitting the peak spending time of their life, around 1990. So naturally, in the 90s, we have a rapidly rising market due to that demographic event. Then we had the dot-com bubble. I'll just put dot-com here. Then shortly after the dot-com bubble, we had some corporate corruption scandals, Enron and WorldCom. And then, of course, the big event that kind of changed the world was 9/11. And so the market is, having all these huge losses. And think about this also in terms of consumer spending. When your nest egg is shrinking, when your 401k and savings are going down, 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 down due to the market, you feel poorer. When you feel poorer, what do you do with your spending? You curb it, you cut it. And when you cut your spending, what happens to the market and what happens to GDP and corporate profits? They go down, and thus the market responds by going down even further. So what ends up happening is you get into this negative feedback loop. People get afraid, so they stop spending money. The market responds by going down even further, so we get into a negative feedback loop. The Federal Reserve, Greenspan was chairman at the time, said we've got to do something to get consumer spending going again. So let's think about this for a second. What's the largest item by far that a typical consumer will buy in their lifetime? A house. So what did they choose to get consumer spending going again? Housing. And so you probably remember all this. They got the banks to make loans to people who really shouldn't have had loans for mortgages, but it was effective because housing is a major component of consumer spending. So that was effective at getting consumer spending going again, and it did turn the market around from 2003 roughly to 2007 roughly. But then what happened? Because this was an artificial bubble, all the banks started to fail. Washington Mutual, Bear Stearns, and then the one that people remember was right here, I'll just abbreviate, Lehman Brothers. In the fall of 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed and the market went in a free fall, and we bottomed out in March of 09. Now this is interesting to note that the low of 09, notice how it's slightly lower than the low of 2003. I think that's important to note because I think what the market was telling us here is that this whole housing bubble was all artificial. So the market was just correcting to a point where it would have been without the artificial stimulant. Another thing that's interesting to note is after the market started going down and these banks started to fail, once again, that negative feedback loop that I started to talk about just a minute ago kicks in. People feel poorer, they stop spending, the market responds by going down even further. So the Fed's already shot the housing bullet, they can't fire that round again. So they say, well, what's the next biggest item that a consumer will buy? That's right, a car. Remember cash for clunkers? They did cash for clunkers about right there. What's the third biggest item that a consumer will buy? Typically appliances. They did a version of cash for clunkers for appliances shortly after they did cash for clunkers. None of that was enough to get consumer spending going again. Why not? Think about where we are in the timeline. The housing bubble started to pop in 2007. What did I tell you just a moment ago about demographics? If we add 1962, which is the peak of the baby boom, we add 45 years to that to account for where consumers peak in spending, we get the year 2007. So by this time in the timeline, we now have declining numbers of the peak spending demographic combined with the housing bubble popping at the same time. So cash for clunkers and appliances, none of that was enough to get it going again. So what's left? The only thing that's left at this point is government spending. So government spending has to increase dramatically to keep GDP from falling dramatically. This is not going to be without dramatic consequences, we believe. because this whole recovery, we believe, is mostly artificially driven by this bond bubble. Government spending increasing due to borrowed money from the Fed through government bonds. So we believe that we're currently in a bond bubble, and just like the market reset to a point lower than it did in '03, we believe that when the market corrects, it's going to correct to a point that's lower than the low of March of '09.